Hey, everybody, welcome. Welcome to our 6th episode of In the Hot Seat. For our repeat viewers, thank you so much for joining us again. For those new to the show, every 2 weeks, be sure to join us because we put industry experts and customers in the hot seat for a lively discussion, sometimes a debate, which I have a feeling that's what today is going to be, and even some discourse. As we humanize the digital experience, we cover all aspects of the customer life cycle. Everything is up for discussion through every phase of the journey, including, and probably most importantly, the technologies that are used throughout that journey. To those of you who are streaming us on LinkedIn, we have been having some issues with the platform. So if you find yourself in a very frustrating loop, please feel free to move on over to YouTube or to Facebook, where the experience may be a little bit smoother for you. Now, let's get into what is our 3rd episode of a 5-part series that we are theming Experience the Engagement. I am Jody Spencer, and joining me is Thomas Wieberneit. Sorry, Thomas. I will get that right by the time we finish co-hosting this at the end of the year.
Yep.
Today, we are focusing on Web3, right? Web3 promises to give more power into the hands of content producers and web users via a lot of different concepts with decentralization, blockchain, token economy. But the idea of power to the user, right, Thomas, it was kind of the foundation for Web1 and Web2. So
It was, yeah.
right? So today, our guests, John Reed and Jared Zabel, we're going to get their thoughts on Web3, and we're going to see if they think that it's going to deliver on this promise. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a big furball. So, lots. Yeah. Well, we are not really clear what it is, right? So there's lots of hype. There's lots of different technologies that are involved, and hence lots of confusion. So, and talk is back and forth, and this is what will bring the fun into the debate. Yes, we have a bunch of people who are firmly in the yay camp, who say this is it, this is what's coming for the future, what's delivering the future, what will be it. And then there are other people who are saying, nah, probably not. So who are more on the nay camp, the skeptics. Yeah. And
hey, let's not forget that middle group, right?
In between, there's this bunch of middle group, and these are the ones who both parties, the yay camp and the nay camp, need to win. So
Absolutely.
let's start with it.
And hopefully at the end of this discussion, those people who are in the middle camp are going to have enough information to side with one of our guests who have strong opinions on both sides. So let's introduce them now. Jared got his start working for Samsung VR in 2017, where he led experimental marketing campaigns in prominent retail locations. He was then hired to help lead the Spectacles program at Snap, where he completed over 25 AR-enabled activations across the US, and he received the Cannes Award for pop-up and experimental retail design. He has since worked for Fox, leading their technology program implementations, including the rollout of Zoom and the MoveWorks chatbot, which resolves employee issues autonomously and at scale. Most recently, Jared led strategic formats at GameStop, where he implemented in-store demo experiences for high-end gaming computers for the first time in the company's history. Jared now serves as the CEO of OpenPark, a data analytics company focused on pet wellness, and has some pretty strong opinions on Web3.
Well, and in the other camp, with equally strong opinions, we have John Reed. John Reed is very well known. He got his enterprise start in 1994. Man, am I old that I can remember those times. He ran at that time an IT recruiting desk and built an ERP recruiting practice. These days, John is a roving blogger and analyst with Diginomica, and also advises vendors and startups on reaching today's informed enterprise buyer. Now, basically, as the sales funnel is discredited, this is part of his core role and core being. He's a Diginomica co-founder, enterprise irregular, avid podcaster, and all around a very interesting person. So let's bring them in.
Hi, gentlemen.
Hi, folks. How are you guys?
So we ready for a good discussion?
Indeed.
All right.
Alrighty. Then let's get right into the middle of it, because as we said right in the beginning, so there's lots of confusion around, which is probably based upon what is Web3? What is it at all? So it's probably good to get your respective opinions, starting with Jared here, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Web3 to me is an iteration of existing protocols on the internet that have a focus on decentralization and connecting users to their communities. In other words, it's the genesis of all of the technology we've been building for many years that we've now come to a point that we understand how to use it more efficiently. So there's definitely a priority on efficiency.
Well, we already disagree.
I love it. We
can't even define the terms, and we disagree. I also want to make clear. That I really like Jarrett. I like what he's doing, and I have no objections to any of what he's trying to do. A lot of my problems with this have to do with how this whole thing is framed. But the Web3 that to me Jarrett is referring to is not some collective iteration, but a strong venture capital driven agenda around blockchain and metaverse technologies as the next future of everything. But in fact, there's a lot of competing visions, and the term Web 3.0 was actually coined a number of years ago, which pertained more to the semantic web. But I would agree, however, that there's something very productive about this discussion nonetheless, because it comes down to the fact, and I'll explain a little more in this, but that the future of the internet is sort of up for grabs at the moment, and there's this sense that control of data and user empowerment has waned in the face of algorithmic walled gardens. And so can we find some creative solutions to that? That's the productive part of this discussion. And I think Web3 as a model is one voice in that discussion, but I reject the idea that it's where everything is going.
Yeah, I think actually, while we disagree on maybe the exact semantics of the definition, I think we do agree that it's a solution for the future of the internet or technology, but it is a movement that's forming, right? Where people, venture capitalists aside, have saw value in the ability to retain digital ownership and use that digital ownership to build a community with direct link.
Right. So a couple of things we talked about before this was like that we're gonna. So there's a few problems with Web3. One is, as a term, we have to deconstruct the different parts of it a little bit.
Yeah.
And we kind of agreed to leave the metaverse aside today. I hope listeners aren't too disappointed with that. But honestly, we could spend the whole hour arguing about the metaverse.
And I don't think we should.
No, we should.
Yeah. So we're kind of putting the metaverse.
Yeah.
We're putting the metaverse on the shelf, but the metaverse plays a pretty important role in why venture capitalists are salivating over Web3, because they want to tokenize and monetize this imaginary world. And so that's a big reason why, Anderson Horowitz has put up a $5 billion Web3 fund. Metaverse is a big part of that. But we're putting that aside, and so we're kind of focused more on the term. And I think for our purposes, let's throw out Web3 versus Web 3.0 and trying to define the differences between the semantic web and this other stuff, and just call this a Web3 discussion on the future of everything. And in that context, there's two terms we really have to look at closely, because I have a problem with both of these terms and how they're idealized. One is decentralization, which is often not a reality in a lot of blockchain projects, although I think it's an interesting goal. And the other is immutability, which is like really a dangerous term to use, because it gives users this sense that their assets are secure, when in fact nothing on the web in any technology is secure. Security is a discipline, and it's a discipline that's going to have to be applied to Web3 as well. And just on the latest with the FTX headlines, $300 million of tokens disappeared somehow during this whole meltdown. Oh, that's too bad. Who took them? Like, did we get hacked? Immutability takes away the collective responsibility for protecting everyone's assets. And so those are the two terms that I think really need to be challenged in terms of like, to what extent are they real, and to what extent does Web3 deliver on decentralization?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll jump in there. I would just say, I agree 100% that decentralization is a goal. Often it's an improvement on existing walled gardens, as you mentioned previous, but to actually have decentralization, it's fueled by choice in open markets. And the idea that there is no single player, or else we have just a recreation of the previous ecosystem. But I know where we see success in Web3 and with decentralization, is having multiple players who pride themselves on achieving that goal in the long term and are providing foundational ecosystems and technology to support it.
So, Jared, let me ask, because you brought up the previous iteration, if you will. So, how does Web3 differ from Web2?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think ultimately it comes down to the core technology, the blockchain, distributed ledger, informational cycle of data exchange, and who owns and retains the base level. And so in a world of the previous Web2, a single company is owning servers that are maintaining and storing data for users, and the users don't have a direct link access to the source. Wherein the future iteration of this Web3, we see a distributed ledger where we have not one central authority controlling all of the inputs, but many users or many nodes or distributed vehicles to collect and store information that can then be protected by virtue of having no single point of failure.
So let me ask a follow-up question to that, right? Because in being in the middle camp of trying to really wrap my head around this and say, like, where do I fall? Isn't there still needs to be some type of clearinghouse, even when when you go to this concept of decentralization in some ways, right? Because you have, take a example for the paintings, right? Let's say you have a piece of artwork and people are buying pieces of that artwork. Who owns that? There has to be almost like a central clearinghouse, right, for that information. So on some level, doesn't somebody still own the product or the piece, the components? Isn't there still some level of centralization?
Well, I think it depends on, I mean, certainly there is a creator, right, on one end of the cycle. The creator can come in the form of an individual or brand. And I think it's up to the purchaser to decide how they view the authority of that asset, right? So in some cases, it is very open and upfront that when you purchase an asset, you own the IP and you can do what you'd like with it. In other regards, you're buying into an experience, right? Where, again, the IP might not be yours, but because of your ownership of the token, the decentralized token approach, you have access that you otherwise wouldn't. And so I think it really comes down to how the brand is using the technology. But on its core level, it's the token and how the token is exchanged that is powering the experience on the blockchain and with Web3. John, go ahead.
Thomas, you wanted to get in there. It's your show, so I don't want to stop
Well, I wanted basically you to get into it as well with a related point to it. Because as Jared said, so it's about the ownership and proving the ownership. Now, on the other hand, there is, with or without blockchain, nothing that prevents us from proving an ownership right now. So why do we need that? Does it solve a problem that hasn't been solved before, or does it solve it somehow better?
Well, look, I mean, I do think that there is a pending crisis, especially for visual artists, if you want to talk about creators, where NFTs show some interesting potential to validate what a core authentic piece of art would be versus a duplicate, and visual artists have been scammed and ripped off constantly on the internet. And I think there's some interesting use cases there, but you guys are still a little bit ahead of me. Decentralization is deeply problematic when you talk about tokenized environments. I'll bet a lot of these folks that have been victimized by these crypto disasters would love a little more centralized supervision right now than the BS around decentralization that ended up costing them a lot of money. So the dangerous thing about decentralization is when you tie it to finance, now you're talking about unregulated markets. And that works great on the dark web because people are buying and selling criminal services. But it doesn't work so good for the average person. And I want the average person to be aware that these are very speculative, unregulated exchanges we're talking about here. And a lot of people have gotten hurt. And that's one of the things that kind of upsets me about this kind of talk. And it's important to be clear, decentralization has been around for as long as the internet, and it's been a powerful force for good in many cases. This is not a new concept. These Web3 folks didn't just come up with decentralization. Wikipedia is a very successful example of decentralization. One of the things, and I'll put this aside for the rest of the conversation because I don't think Jared has taken this point of view, but many of the venture capitalists behind Web3 do present it as the future of everything. And one of the reasons that's wildly irresponsible is that blockchain has not proven that it can handle that from a technical and scale perspective. Yeah. And I can spend a number of minutes walking you through some high-profile blockchain failures at the moment that where blockchain is just not yet proven. In 2016, I started writing some optimistic articles about this with startups who thought they could solve these problems of scale and performance, never mind energy consumption. None of these have been solved. But having said that, that doesn't mean that pursuits like the one Jared is doing or an NFT marketplace couldn't be very successful on the blockchain. The problem is how this is framed. If it's framed as the future of everything, then I have a serious problem with it. If it's framed as one viable alternative that could be compelling for, say, creators or for certain kinds of rare, authentic validation of materials or certain kinds of exchanges, then I'm really interested in that. But I do want to explain at some point this how we got here, because I define Web 2.0 a little bit differently, because Web 2.0 for me was, and this is one reason why I get emotional about this topic, because I idealized this time in Web 2.0 where it was kind of a time where the rise of the blogger and the long form content, and that you could be discovered simply for having a unique point of view and get recognized for that. But at the same time, these forces were brewing. YouTube was cropping up. Social media was starting to crop up. But I call that actually Web 2.5. And Web 2.5 to me was the rise of the algorithmic walled gardens, where you had dominant internet presences like Facebook and so on. And we saw just how much harm these viral algorithmic business models cause. And we don't need to dwell on that, but potentially they swing elections. But what we do know is that disinformation at scale polarizes society, and that's what these algorithmic walled gardens thrive on. And while I talked about regulation, they're not as regulated as they should be. I think right now we're in what I would call Web 2.8, which is that there is a little bit of disillusionment about these walled garden environments, which is sparking folks like Jared to provoke these really interesting conversations, which is great. But there's also this next generation of algorithmic walled gardens that are emerging now, which is the TikToks and the video shorts and all this stuff. And these environments are not going to step aside for Web 3.0 to succeed. They are going to persist. And so this idea that there's some kind of vacuum right now is insane.
Let's gear it a little bit. So we have talked a lot about creators and B2C like of scenarios. How about B2B scenarios? Is there any viability, any business case that goes into
Absolutely.
Into this world that are strongly helped by this type and set of technologies at all?
Of course. I think on a business-to-business play, just referencing what we do at Open Park, it's connecting a user to a brand or a business who seeks to better understand the customer set, and then empowering the user to opt in or out, and incentivizing the data sharing with rewards. So that's an interesting capability that is an advent of rewards, and to be against going along with what John is saying, it doesn't require Web3 technologies. It is actually just an integration point for our business that we found to be more efficient in how we conduct business. And so that's why we made the decision. But one of the great things about OpenPark is we're not branding ourselves as a Web3 company. We're building products for future customers who are seeking to better understand the space. And really, we're packaging blockchain and Web3 NFTs as value up front. And the reason we integrate with these technologies is a product-based decision that prioritizes users' experience. So it's all about user experience. And then the other one I would say is supply chain. Having worked in freight and logistics and understanding the nightmare of product delivery and arrivals and counts and scaling that business across America, and really understanding that freight is what powers a lot of our in-store retail experience. I think freight supply chain is ripe for disruption with these technologies. Just understanding, again, its efficiency, right? Understanding that every piece of inventory has a unique record already that's maybe being written on a piece of paper. And instead, it's now tokenized and digital and slapped on an NFC. So we understand in augmented reality with a headset that the freight operator is wearing, where and how and when to pack an item, and exactly the path that they should take. So I think there's some interesting capabilities to disrupt even back-end industries that aren't user-facing.
On the other hand, if I can just butt in here, IBM and Maersk just shut down their TradeLens supply chain platform, which was one of the most heavily hyped of the supply chain tracing and tracking platforms. And I think the reason why it was shuttered is pretty interesting in terms of this debate, because one of the really cool things about blockchain that makes it unique is the public transparency of the model. And so when you have in the enterprise, Thomas, the problem is that a lot of use cases aren't necessarily public, in the sense that a lot of times there's a dominant supplier that wants to dictate terms to the rest of their cohorts, right? So Walmart doesn't need blockchain because they can dictate accountability, and they don't have to deal with the trade-offs, the negatives of blockchain, because they can just use whatever database they want. But if you, in the case of this IBM Merck's thing, to Jared's point, what was interesting was it was an industry consortium. And so the idea is that now I'm outside company walls, and now I'm collaborating with other people in my industry, and no, I don't want to trust anyone else with owning and running that. I want that to be publicly visible. And so that's where blockchain gets interesting, and that's why this scenario got a lot of attention. But when you dig into the failures, then it was hard to dig into why it stopped, because a lot of the information wasn't revealed. The things that I read, it was less about the technology limitations in that case. It was more about the fact that it's hard to get industry partners to cooperate with each other. And there was the perception that because Maersk was the sponsored party, that they had an undue perhaps influence on the rest of it. And so that's why it's a little bit tricky for businesses, that the best thing about blockchain is this public transparency. And that's why it excites people that want to change the finance system, because they can do that collectively, to Jared's point, in a community where everyone is visible on an exchange. In B2B, that doesn't translate and so well. And so instead, what you get is blockchain's limitations being exposed. And so, for example, just recently in the last few days, we found out that another very high-profile enterprise blockchain use case, the ASX Australian Exchange, has now been officially shuttered. And what was interesting was that Accenture did an independent review, which I found ironic, because Accenture is one of the firms that has pumped up Web3 more than just about any other firm on the planet. But they were brought in to do this independent review, and what we found is that in that case, a lot of technical problems were holding this back, including things like latency, concurrency, batch processing. Oh my gosh, batch processing on an exchange? That's not very promising, right? Batch processing has a terrible rep in the industry. That's what enterprises are trying to get away from. And then on top of this, the practical limits of the DAML ledger API, the size of an object on the ledger. This gives you a sense of like, look, if this exchange can't be powered by blockchain, how the hell can we talk about powering the internet on this stuff? You can't. But what you can do is talk about the kind of stuff Jared's talking about, which is building smaller communities that have a shared accountability. And in that case, I'm very open to these discussions.
Let's let's add to it. We just had an interesting question by friend and colleague Sven Esser here. So advertising as refinancing. John already briefly touched on finance, DeFi, but the advertising part is quite interesting because advertising as such as an industry, I mean, that is, well, fraud by excellence, one could just say, yeah? Because there's no transparency and hence no real accountability from all those involved agencies. How do you think that can or cannot be changed using blockchain or, well, basically blockchain technologies? Jared?
Just talking about, again, just using my personal experience, I think for Web3 marketing, it's a bit like all the other technologies in Web3. We're early, it's the Wild West. There are certainly some interesting things that you can do with airdrops that are, while I find them kind of an annoyance, I think with the right fit team and delivery probably serves as an effective form of marketing. But really today, Web3 marketing for me is a combination effect of the best parts of Web2, social-based marketing with what we're seeing in Web3, where we're leveraging community growth and trying to establish a direct link with a customer. A friend of mine, an advisor, mentor, Tony Drummond, he's the co-founder of MicroPets. He taught me something interesting about Web3 marketing. He calls it the target avatar, where instead of thinking about advertising to actual avatars in a metaverse, he's trying to explain how to think about your customer as an avatar, as a persona that you could market directly to. We see this in Web2 with the actual market, the target market demographic fit, but who is this person online? And then could you think of them as an avatar and speak directly to them through your messaging? And so that you're not only hitting all of their need points, but you're messaging out where they live. And sometimes, in the case of our company at Open Park, our market demographics today are a split between a crypto native audience and an audience that has not yet really fully adopted these technologies. So trying to market to those different customer sets looks very different.
I think when we talk about marketing too, is in this environment, right? One of the, as we're talking about the blockchain and fundamental components of the technology, I mean, I keep coming back to, even from marketing, security, right? Giving up my data, giving up my information, letting you know more about me. I mean, at some level, right? I don't have a comfort level with how secure this infrastructure is. So why am I going to give you personal information about me, right? Like, what's the driving factor for me?
I'll just jump in really quick there, John. All I would say is that, at least in our case, we keep it in a closed ecosystem, right? So we're not exposing information out. It's similar to Web2. Open Park is retaining information and not making it publicly accessible to all of the blockchain, because we're just integrated with the tech. We're not fully one way or the other. And so in that regard, you're placing trust through verification with Open Park service. And therefore, it's similar but different. You're placing trust in the provider.
So just real quick on Sven's question, I want to see if I can answer it from another angle, because I think he's kind of talking about financing the future of the internet, because one of the big questions going forward is, if you want to move away from these massive walled gardens, you need a way to fund everything, right? And and I'm like actually a really huge fan of user supported content, and that's not necessarily a Web3 thing, though it could be in some cases. But for example, there's a lot more subscription based content going on right now at the consumer level that I think is pretty exciting. I support a local site in Boston that is self-sufficient through user subscriptions. Substack, I think, is a very interesting model. The Patreon economy is very interesting, though some of these services are going to go through a lot of growing pains around that. But this notion of pay for what you get is a little bit of a liberator from this diabolical exchange we have with these free services where we know they're not really free. To Jody's point, we're giving up our data often a lot more seriously than we ever realized to participate in these things. So
Maybe,
Sven, I think that users need to pony up and pay for the internet that they want to the extent that they're capable of doing that. Unfortunately, that does leave open the question of those who can't afford that, how they're going to be exploited by these systems. As far as advertising is concerned, from a pure technical standpoint, blockchain's not capable of supporting real-time advertising. That's one of the most performance-intensive activities on the planet. The way web advertising works, it's all very real-time, and the algorithm's making constant decisions at massive scale. So blockchain's a terrible fit for that. But I do think NFTs are kind of interesting, and I'm sure Jared has views on that. But like, I think from a marketing standpoint, NFTs can be very interesting for companies. Certain kinds of collectibles. Now, I don't think all of those have to be NFTs. In some cases, they could be other platforms. But for example, like you could imagine like being a customer and being delighted to receive an NFT that entitles you to attend the trade show for the next 5 years, free, or the same with some kind of like rewards kind of activity. And I think some of these things can be pretty cool if NFTs can show that they can really are unique and can't be easily duplicated and copied, which is a little bit of a problem at the moment. But I think that's still pretty appealing in my view as a marketing tactic.
Loyalty.
So maybe we agree on something, which would be cool.
Well, there are two more quite interesting comments. Let's start with what George Andrews says.
I think I kind of just answered that in a way.
Yeah, you answered that kind of a way, but it still would be interesting to see Jared's point there in how far one can actually combine physical and digital worlds a little better.
Yeah,
it's a different slant
absolutely.
from what you had, John.
This is a bit of a slam dunk and also an inside job. George actually is running InfoSec for Open Park, so thank you, George, for attending.
Okay, so you got a supporter,
yeah? I didn't plant that seed intentionally, but George is an awesome and supportive team member.
Mm-hmm.
The way I would answer this question is, look, there is a different approach. As an entrepreneur who went out for investment in the previous iteration just a couple of years ago, right, in the Web2 ecosystem, you have investors that are very focused on software as a service, low overhead, high rocket ship potential, and are less interested in businesses like mine that have a physical place, right? Mm-hmm. And that actually want to spend capital on experience towards users and reprioritizing how business models are run. So by using NFTs with utility, what we're able to do is attach a membership, an ID, one that in an app-based ecosystem is just a record identifier. And now it's a token on the blockchain. So it retains value. That's a benefit, right? If one is purchased and another is purchased, there's a floor price. There's a past purchase price of that value. And that value can be the same value as an existing membership to, say, Equinox, like a gym. And so now you're paying the same amount, but you change your mind in 3 months. There's an opportunity, if the community that you've purchased into is strong enough, that you could resell your membership to recoup all or more or less of what you paid, what you purchased. And now understanding that the token retains value, well, what is it? What are the benefits that it entitles you to? Can be physical access to a place, as you mentioned, John, right? Suddenly Coca-Cola sends you an exclusive NFT. You've been a Coca-Cola fan for life, and now you get to go to a Coca-Cola event for the first time, and they market it directly to you, versus you seeing their advertisement in a grocery store and taking some sort of action online. Yeah. So the access to a physical place or an experience, I think, is interesting. I think the opportunity to communicate both ways with users. So the immutability or the dynamic nature of an ERC 721A token allows me to dynamically update an NFT's art or graphic. And so in an interesting case, instead of painting apes, what if the NFT that you're referencing actually provided you with useful information, like a snapshot view, a dashboard view of some sort of data that you're actually providing to the organization or the community that you're supporting? I think in addition, what we're seeing with even Bored Ape and the DAO, the by the Dallas, by the Rams, where you're seeing collectives come together to purchase billion-dollar initiatives. I think the idea that we could share value and share profits with users is an interesting opportunity through NFTs and DAO ownership, wherein because we understand who you are as a holder and your wallet address, we can airdrop you currency that has some sort of retained value, and that would further incentivize the benefits of the utility for the NFT.
Right.
Sorry
And-
for
and
my
so
chuckling,
I just-
Jared. I just need to bring. I just chuckled, so this was not you. This was the host. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Huge
We
fan.
got-
I'm
we got a
realizing that I
sports
could
fan
go
here.
on all day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me just say, a different example would be good for the sports there, but I won't bring
Yeah.
up the Patriots because I know I'll be kicked off the show if I do.
No, I'll keep you, John.
Oh, okay, thanks.
We need you.
And look, I mean, these are cool and interesting things. I just want to just make a distinction, though, that what Jared's talking about here, this is a far cry from the revolution of the future of everything, which is how Web3 has been positioned by its venture capitalists. And I just want to be clear that there's a huge difference here. And if we can talk about this on a smaller scale, then I personally have a lot less objections, though I think in some cases classic loyalty programs can achieve some of the same things. But I do think there's some very interesting things that can be done there that are probably worth looking into. One thing I wanted to just walk you guys through real quick, though, is this question I think needs to be answered of why has decentralization been so elusive? And I want to explain a little bit about that because, like, the biggest NFT market is centralized. The biggest crypto markets are centralized. FTX was centralized. And I think with the collapse of some of these markets, there's a crypto documentarian who has Web3 is going really great site where she tracks these misadventures, and there's now a ticker on her site over $12 billion in lost assets that people have invested. So this is going to be actually a push for a lot more regulation and centralization. And so the decentralized advocates are going to have to push back against that and show that they can solve these same compliance problems in a different way. But why is centralization such a powerful force in the history of the internet, given that I'm a huge decentralized guy? Like, I signed up for Mastodon, and it took me friggin' 2.5 weeks to get approved onto a server and all this
Really?
stuff. And
I was faster.
well, the point is, that's not like dialing up America Online. That's a
Nope.
project to get approved to a Mastodon server and find the right server, understand that server's rules, figure out how to follow people across servers, all that stuff. Decentralization tends to be a super user experience, and centralization works because of the power of these viral algorithms to drive traffic. They can invest in these massive servers at scale. They have a better user experience generally with sticky and intuitive mobile apps. Centralized operations are more easily regulated, as I pointed out. And here's the rough part, is that data ownership and privacy just don't matter to people as much as we would like it to.
Yeah.
It matters to me, and it matters to a lot of people, and I think there's some geographical variation here. I think it matters a little more in Europe right now than it does here, for example, in the US. But in general, I wish we were much more militant as a collective nation and internet community around our right to data privacy, because that would really put power behind a lot of the things folks like Jared are trying to do if people cared more about that. I'm shocked by it. I mean, you look at things like Equifax, and I've had my identity stolen, so I know this kind of thing. Why aren't those people like serving prison sentences right now, or at least facing massive fines for those kinds of things? This goes on. And so I think we have to be a little careful about over idealizing people's desire for data privacy when there's so much evidence they're willing to swap that for convenience.
Let's come back to one earlier comment of Martin Lindeskog, because it fits very well into where we are going right now. It's about value for value. Yeah. So in how far can that be done or supported? Not that I know what Satoshi's then are as opposed to bits of Bitcoins. So we can this be probably covered or supported?
I'm curious actually to better understand this question. John, I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's different ways I could go about answering, but before I pick one,
Well, let me just answer real quick, Jared, and you can pile on. I don't know Martin exactly because I don't even hold any Bitcoin. I'm not like an expert in that stuff, so I'm sorry about that. But one thing I do think is we do need to solve for micropayment capabilities if we want to talk about a lot of these futures. Like we need to be able to have a lot of microtransactions all the time. And right now I don't think like the PayPals of the world and stuff have solved for that. And so this if you own your own data, in theory, you should have some kind of ability to constantly exchange in micropayments use of that data for various things, right? I mean, that's part of this whole notion of linked data. And if you want to monetize the semantic web, you're going to need some kind of capability to do that.
yeah.
But I just paying attention to the clock here because we've been just, I can't believe we're already 40 minutes into this, right? We have 5 minutes left, and I think we've kind of touched upon only half of the questions that we wanted to get through. I'm kind of feeling like we need a part two.
Yeah.
Right? Both of you need to come back for a part two, but John, I think we were starting to get into kind of the parting question, right? If we can kind of summarize this and hopefully we'll get you back here to finish off because we had some great questions come up. But what is the biggest potential for Web3, right? As we're wrapping up the show, what should people be thinking about in terms of next steps, and how should people think about Web3? I see lots of
Jared,
chuckles because I know there's going to be
Jared,
two very different answers.
Jared,
so.
you want to go first?
Yeah, I think for me, it is the entrepreneurial journey, right? We're going to see so many wonderful new business models, new ideas come to light because the communities that support them want them to be real. And so while I think I actually do disagree with you, John, that the future of the internet may be in part led by these venture capital firms, I think it'll be defined by entrepreneurs that understand the value of this new technology and can see past the current limitations, both society, with our current societal structure, and how in the future there is an opportunity to see some of the same use cases but grander and more focused on value to consumers and better experiences across the board.
Well, I sure hope you're right, because the walled gardens that dominate the landscape today are slowly destroying culture and society and polarizing communities and destabilizing nations. So anything
Right.
entrepreneurs like you can do to change that is wonderful. And, Jason Lundy and a couple other folks like Josh have been chiming in around privacy and my point around that and the rise of TikTok just kind of shows us that people are addicted to these algorithmic communities. And so that's a really, really difficult force to contend with. But there's three things I want to just briefly say. As an individual, I think what I want to get across for individuals is that the future of the internet is not set in stone. Do not accept the terms that have been handed down to you at face value to define this. Create the future of the internet yourself. Speak out, be informed, learn about this stuff. There's tons of resources out there. I'd point you to things like the Crypto Critics Corner, which isn't as negative as it sounds. It's got a lot of very objective, interesting dialogue. So there's a lot of ways to get educated. From a creator standpoint, there's all kinds of exciting things to look at as a content creator, but it's not just Web3 stuff like NFTs. It's subscription-based platforms and everything else. Look at how you can connect to audiences, but remember that becoming a celebrity is not a very winning model. It's about building businesses that make a difference in people's lives. Figure out how to do that. And then finally, for enterprises, just don't buy into the idea that these pilot projects can operate at scale, because they can't. I've been waiting 5 years for a live blockchain project so I can interview them. It's my open challenge. I have yet to receive it. So for enterprises, just understand that there's a difference between a revolution and a tool. Tools are useful. Blockchain is a useful tool for enterprises to evaluate. It's not a revolution, and that's my big story here.
John, Jared, Thank you so much. Like, as I said, time has flown, right? I have a list of about another 6 questions that I just really want answered. So hopefully when we put out the request, you both will nod yes and come back to join us.
Well, if you want to do a
dive into
second part,
this.
if you want to do a second part that hones in on the metaverse, I'm sure that would be equally.
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay, we might go to a
Equally
3-part
fabulous.
series here then.
Yeah.
You know, I agree to disagree with you, John. I agree that it is not the revolution, but I would say the revolution is coming. We're just not there yet.
Well, I can't stop at
Just
that
wanna-
note though, because the difference, there's a huge difference there, because Web 2.0, the adoption came first and then the terminology. This is going in the wrong order.
Right.
We're trying to define
Yeah.
it before it's happened. Adoption should
needs to happen.
define.
Yeah.
If you can prove me the adoption, then I'll give it to you. But this idea that a handful of billionaires in Silicon Valley can dictate our futures, I completely reject. What you're trying to do, I can support. But I can't call it a revolution yet. A revolution is
Not
when
yet.
everyone's doing it, not when you can point to a handful of happy stories.
This is perfect. This is what we
And
wanted.
with that, I love it. Taking it right down to the wire,
I love
gentlemen. Thank you.
Yeah.
We are going to continue this discussion.
Yeah.
This is all the time we have today. John, Jared, you both survived the hot seat, so thank you so much. To
That was
those
fun.
of you watching, if you think
I enjoyed
you
it.
have what it takes to be in our hot seat, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. This is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jody Spencer.
And I'm Thomas Wieberneit.
Tune in next time for some different faces, different topics, potentially part 2 of this discussion as we put somebody new and bring back Jared and John to get back in the hot seat and finish the discussion. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.